Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast for literacy leaders and champions everywhere, brought to you by Reading Horizons. Literacy Talks is the place to discover new ideas, trends, insights, and practical strategies for helping all learners reach reading proficiency. Our hosts are Stacy Hurst, a professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Advisor for Reading Horizons. Donell Pons, a recognized expert and advocate in literacy, dyslexia, and special education. And Lindsay, an elementary classroom teacher, author, and speaker. Now, let's talk literacy.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. My name is Stacy Hurst, and I'm joined by Donell Pons and Lindsay. And this season, we are focusing on the Perspectives of Language and Literacy 75th anniversary issue. We've had some fantastic guests. We've talked about a lot of the articles in that publication, and this week is no different. Today, we're going to be talking about the WHO, and the article that we'll be discussing is titled Structured Literacy, the Backbone of a Robust Literacy Ecosystem. And this article is by Timothy Odegard. But as many of you know, he is a professor of psychology at Middle Tennessee State University. His background is in developmental cognitive psychology. I think you can tell that from the article. And also he does a lot of research and is well known for his research on reading difficulties and dyslexia. And I know Donell and Lindsay, you and I we have all seen him in person in conferences. What are some of the things that stand out to you about his background or his presentations, just anything in general for our listeners who may not be familiar with?
Well, I love that he has dyslexia himself. So he really comes at it with that perspective of having it himself, as well as I think he has a son with it as well, right? So I think that's always really interesting to hear his side of things.
And I think I mentioned his presentation at Plain Talk because it was very impactful. I think he's always really good, but it was a very impactful discussion and presentation. And he does a very thorough job. And I remember the first time I actually heard him speak was a long time ago. I'm going to date myself here. And he was very young at the time. He was very new. And I hadn't seen him anywhere before. And it was at an International Dyslexia Association conference. And this one happened to be in Portland. And I was there with my husband, who comes with me often to those things. And we've talked about how we send him around to different places and he texts us and tells us what's going on. It's fantastic. Well, he popped in on something that he was doing as a presentation. He said, "You've got to come down here right now. This guy is on fire." And he never really sends me those. And so I did. I'd never heard of him before. And I ran down and popped my head in, and he was right. He was on fire. So that's what when I hear Tim Odegard, we're going to learn some good stuff. That's what
I agree. And you know what? One other thing I really admire about him is his vocabulary. I have not one time heard him speak, and I have been lucky enough to have some conversations with him that I don't write down a word or a research reference. And he just has them on the top of his head. Like it just flows like water. So this article actually is no different. And I don't know about you guys, but I wrote down some quotes that when we're talking about something as maybe technical as the word as MTSS, you don't expect these kind of words. But on page 82, right on the first page of the article, he talks about the magical intersection. That was one phrase that I wrote down between, what is he talking about? The magical intersection basically between knowledge and practice, I think is how to sum it up.
Yeah, do you want me to? It says, learning happens at the magical intersection of teacher-facilitated student engagement with oral and written language instruction and practice.
Yeah, I love that. Magical intersection. And then also on page 82, he talks about the beauty and power of structured literacy. So we have some really good things that we'll be able to discuss based on this article, but I appreciate the way that he describes those aspects of it. In this article, he does talk about not that intersection of practice and instruction frequently. He highlights that student learning occurs there at that that crossroads, just as you read the quote, Lindsay. And then he highlighted teacher facilitated engagement and practice in oral and written language. So, Lindsay, as a teacher, how do you or how can teachers ensure that they are effectively facilitating this engagement in their classrooms, especially when it comes to language proficiency?
Well, I think the question should be more, how can we make sure we're supporting our teachers as they're teaching this, right? Because, teachers need the knowledge. We also need the tools. So we need both. And for that oral and that written language to develop, we need professional development with those things. We need coaching with those things. And then we need the tools with these things. So if we have admin or anyone listening in that's thinking, how do we make sure our teachers are doing this? We'll make sure they're supported, right?
Yeah. And I love how he highlighted the need to facilitate that student engagement. And I think it would never be a waste of time to have that be addressed in PD as well. And I know that you have worked a lot with Anita Archer, and anything that she has written or developed would be a good resource in that area.
Yeah. And that quote that we were saying that, you were mentioning how much you love that first quote, Stacy, and I do too. Learning happens at the magical intersection of teacher facilitated student engagement, plus the language instruction and practice. So you've got your instruction, you've got your practice, and teacher facilitated student engagement. So you are not just sending the kids off just to and not facilitating that. You are there making sure they're engaged in your lessons. So yeah, Stacy, totally. I think of Dr. Anita Archer and, everyone does everything, and we're increasing those student responses and making sure our students have plenty of opportunities to respond verbally, physically, vocally. That is huge. And that's when I think you see learning outcomes and engagement really go up, is when you improve those.
Donell, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, obviously my work is in intervention. And so I am working typically one-on-one with a student. And this is everything that we do, right? So from the word go, you're figuring out exactly where your student is and what those needs are. And that's the trick all the time, is to balance out just enough, shall we say, challenge for the student that they are reaching, but yet feel supported. And typically I have students who they were lacking both. So they were not supported correctly or properly, and the reach was way too far. And so those are really important things to keep in balance. And I know classroom teachers do this as well, but particularly in intervention, because you usually have students who are burned out. They weren't getting enough of either of those things. So the distance was too far, it didn't seem reachable, and they weren't getting supported. And so there's just enough support, and the distance is within reach. So the students have to be having moments each time they're learning where they feel like they've conquered something, because these are students who never felt that way, right? It's been years since they've felt that way, particularly about language. That's why they're with you. So I think that's really important. And you do that by constantly providing opportunities, and those are thoughtful opportunities.
Yeah, another way that it could be said is explicit instruction in oral language and written language. And I'm going back to what you both just said, that I think teachers need support in providing that explicit instruction. I know that I certainly was not prepared as a pre-service teacher to do that. And also just really not underestimating the importance of that explicit instruction. So how does that specifically help students with language deficits?
Well, and that's one thing I want to say, because I'm pretty comfortable helping my students with written language. I'm pretty comfortable with that. And we have a lot of resources available for that. But oral language is harder for me. And I don't see a lot of us talking a lot about how to really support students with oral language deficits, because a lot of students come in and they already have the oral language. So, and of course, if you have English learners, they're going to have some more needs. But even just someone with like a language disability, like developmental language disability, right? DLD. So how do you help them? And what resources are available? What's like a scope and sequence? That is probably something that I need the most help with, because I feel like more and more I'm getting students in my classroom with language difficulties. And so I think that's a little trickier.
Yeah.
And I would say in the intervention space, Lindsay, just taking your thought and picking it up, within the intervention space, oftentimes you see all of it treated the same. In other words, a student comes with dyslexia and you do find, as you're having a conversation, oh, there's something going on with oral language here as well. It's never been pulled out and identified. It's all just called dyslexia for a student. And yet that isn't typical of every student who has dyslexia. So the primary definition of dyslexia, right, is a word level reading problem, challenge. Often phonemic awareness is the heart of it. That's our base. But then you'll see a lot of other things that, particularly for a student who's now 12, 13, this should have been talked about and identified sooner. However, we got one diagnosis or statement, dyslexia, and then just put everything underneath that umbrella. That's something you often find in intervention, is that you'll acquire a student who's now older and still struggling with components that should have been pulled out and identified. That's interesting too. So it's along your same lines, Lindsay, of, well, because I was never taught or didn't know, even within an intervention setting where you're specifically working with students who so-called have a challenge with reading, even within that space, there might not be enough information for a lot of folks who are doing intervention too. So it's across the board, I think.
Yeah. And I'm often going to the SLP in our building. Okay, how do I help him with this? Yeah. Or, I have a student who struggles with his pronouns. So he'll say them went to the whatever instead of they went to the, and, I'm like, I was going to her, like, give me some ideas. What else can I do? But then when I think about it, I can think about things I do to teach my students sentence writing. It's kind of the same, but focusing on that verbal, right? And using a picture, who or what's in this picture? What are they doing? Put it together into a sentence, but I guess it would be nice to have more, just thinking about more support throughout the day and in conversation. And do I correct them every time? Or does that, what's the best way forward there?
I think that's a good thing to bring up, because there are many, like you're saying, Donell, a lot of things can fall under that umbrella. And the one you just specifically mentioned, Lindsay, is one. Another one, I had a student once that stuttered, and I didn't know how to address that when he was reading, especially out loud. And there could be a lot of things. So definitely connecting with the speech and language therapist in your building. But I don't know if it's like this everywhere, but ours is spread so thin that she has assigned to her 3 or 4 schools. And so we don't often see her, but she has aides that may or may not be trained in these things, as well trained as she is. So those are things to learn for sure.
And I was just thinking of resources to then share with parents, because oftentimes caregivers really want to be a part of helping as well. But if you yourself don't have enough knowledge within the classroom, then how can you even have resources to then share with a parent to say, you could pick this up and continue some of this support, or even to find out, could a home environment be contributing in some way and they don't know because you just don't have resources? So all of this would be so helpful, right, if we had the information for a lot of folks.
And Lindsay, as you were saying that you would just appreciate more help and support in that area, I'm thinking about how I'm preparing my pre-service teachers. And I think we're doing a little bit better job with oral language than I certainly did when I first started teaching at that level. But with written language, I definitely, in fact, I get to create a new course just focusing mostly on that. But that's a deficit right now for us. And I know, Lindsay, you stated you have a lot of resources and knowledge about written language, but did you learn that after you graduated, or were you support that?
For sure afterwards, right? Yeah. When I did a deep dive myself. And I feel like I'm doing a lot better just building the oral language in my classroom. So I will say that, like, by having scaffolded discussions, and I think just knowing myself how important like oral language, the foundation, is everything. I think my main struggle or concern that I'm trying to relay is when you have a student with a language disability, like where is disability the right word? A major language deficit. So I teach first grade, but both this year and last year, I had, students who came in that could only say 2-3 word sentences. So they were like on a 2 to 3-year-old level. And that's where I'm like, how do I best help and support them, where I really felt like I needed more help in that area.
Yeah. And typically, Lindsay, they arrive without any additional information, right?
Yeah.
They just arrived at the classroom and there's no additional information to say, oh, here's what might have occurred before as well, which could be helpful. So that's the whole way along, more understanding, right? From beginning of that student's educational experience on through.
And just knowing what those developmental milestones are. That is one thing I teach my students. And generally speaking, they should be able to produce a sentence that is close to the number of years they are in age. Right. So as a 5 or 6-year-old, 2 or 3 word sentence is not good.
A few years behind. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So also in this article, Dr. Odegard emphasizes that something that's been emphasized in other articles too, which I love, is that structured literacy must be integrated into a literacy ecosystem, and the individual language components are necessary, but not sufficient on their own. So why would you, and I feel like we've talked about this so many times, but it's an important thing to highlight. Why do you think that those components like phonics and vocabulary and so forth need to be integrated together rather than an isolation?
Well, they will be integrated when they're a proficient reader, right? Because they're doing all those things. So I think it's okay to be like, this is my phonics time where my goal is phonics. This is my this is when I'm teaching vocabulary in preparation for our close reading. Now my focus is, I think it's okay to have parts of the day where you have something is more your focus. I think it almost has to be, because as teachers, it can't just be like everything all the time, but at the same time, you still are attending to everything. You just have your focus. So in my phonics lessons, my focus is learning those sound symbol correspondences. I'm bringing in the language and the vocabulary. And we've talked about that before too, when they come to a word that your students might not know, or maybe you have a lot of English learners that are going to need a lot more support with some of those words. You're going to attend to the meaning. You're going to read the word and then talk about what it means. And fluency as well. You're building that accuracy, which is part of fluency in your phonics lessons. And then you want to build that automaticity, which is part of fluency. And then you're reading the decodable text, and maybe you're focusing on accuracy and the automaticity and fluency together. Maybe your first read, you're focusing on that accuracy. You do a second read, you're working on getting that smoother. Your third read, you're adding expression. So you see, like I did all that in my phonics lesson. I was thinking about phonics, but I was bringing in the other things. And then later, maybe you're reading, doing a read aloud, but the read aloud, maybe the title has the phonics component you just taught. Hey, you're going to bring in some phonics and point it out while you're also just working on, maybe teaching them how to summarize or find the main idea. But you're bringing in the other components too, right? That's how I see it. So it's like, yes, I'm integrating, but I still have moments of the day where I have key focuses.
Yeah. And I would just emphasize, I love that you breaking that down, Lindsay, and then also talking about developmentally our expectations, right? So that's a part of it. And Lindsay just described that. And then in addition, when you're doing intervention and it's an older student, you might see this happen all within maybe a 45-minute session, right? But you're making sure you're hitting everything together. And maybe the expectation might be slightly different because the student is older. So you can expect to have some things in place. But it's making sure you're not missing anything as well. And you're making key connections for students.
And, I would ask the question too, Donell, because when we're talking about older learners who have experienced struggles in reading, would you I don't know if argue is the right word. Does it become even more important to integrate all of those things together? I mean, it's always important, but speak to the difference there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is part of that strengths and weaknesses piece too, is that all students come with a strength as well. We obviously are focusing on what the deficit is because we're talking about the key pieces that need to be in place for intervention or for instruction. But all students also come with a great many strengths. And so that should be a big part of the intervention lesson as well, is there will be moments within that lesson for a student to really shine. I mean, I have students that excel at all kinds of things, from being able to grasp a story really well and retell it so well, to having an affinity for vocabulary. And we talked about Dr. Tim Odegard with dyslexia and having an affinity for vocabulary. So it's not making assumptions about the whole student just based on one particular need. I mean, that's really good intervention, and that's the integration of everything.
Well said. And I do think students at that stage have seen so many more things, and they're required to integrate it. Whereas we have a little bit of a luxury with the younger learners where we can do a little more isolation or focusing on one thing before we integrate it with another. So,
and think about Scarborough's rope, right? You see those strands separate, but then as you go over to the right, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And that's what we want it to be, where everything is just so connected.
Yeah. And I love, like, all of these things kind of converge together, right? We've been talking a lot this season about structured literacy and all the components and how they should be integrated. And this article is focusing on the system in which we integrate them, right? So it goes beyond that. On page, it's 82 in the printed manual. I think the digital one might be different. Dr. Odegard has a table that says 5 key factors needed to implement response to intervention within MTSS. So there are 2 terms there, response to intervention within MTSS. Donell, can you speak to the difference between those two?
Well, so you just said it. So one is response to intervention, and one is a multiple system of supports for getting the job done. I'm not so sure. I just kind of want to hang out here for a second. What I'm going to hear inevitably, and I think inevitably what some listeners are probably thinking is, I never see this. So it doesn't matter what definitions we give if you're in a location where you never see this. So let's kind of speak to that a little bit for a minute, because I want to honor that. Because that's typically later when someone is having, they'll say, well, to be frank, when you were talking about that, I've never seen that. I didn't even know what you were talking about. I've never seen it before. So Lindsay, you're currently in a school setting, and I hate to put you on the spot, but what does it look like where you're at on the ground? If we were to say these terms, how familiar would a teacher be with these terms? Have they ever heard them? Would they see them used?
Yeah, I think they've heard them. I do think it's common to not understand the difference, but it almost doesn't matter because MTSS or RTI, whatever you call it, looks different depending on what school you're at, what district you're at, what systems you have available. So, at our school, we don't have a differentiated tier 1 setup, like how some people go across the grade levels and they divide their students. And let's say they're going to different rooms for their phonics lessons. And then you have a bunch more adults usually come in and it's all separate. We don't have that at our school. We do our tier 1 in our classrooms with our own class. You can't, of course, you differentiate within the tier 1. Then students that are not reaching benchmark, your grade level goals, because a lot of students, that's all they'll need is tier 1 and they can achieve, your grade level goals. But other students are going to need additional support. So that's considered a tier 2 intervention where they're getting something else in order to get to grade level. If they're still not responding and we're not getting them caught up, then we need to work on getting them at tier 3 services. So even more intensive, even more, more often, more frequent. So all those things are to support them to reach grade level goals. And what sometimes bothers me is when people say, oh, he's a special ed student, like he's a tier 3 kid. They're all tier 1 kids, right? They all need support from their general education teacher. And my worry is that sometimes I see kids that are pulled out that then the teachers kind of check out and think it's the special education teacher's job to help them. That really like hurts me, especially as a, mother of a son with dyslexia, because I'm like, no, they still need intervention from their teacher. They need instruction and intervention from your general ed teacher, as well as the interventionist, the special ed, whatever is set up by your school.
So that's interesting, just listening to you describe it, because we've talked about the RTI, response to intervention, the tiered 3-tier system, but then also MTSS is a broader framework, which ought to include social and emotional well-being. And I don't know that I've ever seen that part really being at play.
Okay.
Because as we say, right? What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah, well, we do. And now I'm remembering when we had a podcast episode a while back on MTSS, and we did talk about what's the difference between RTI, MTSS. And I remember we were saying MTSS includes other things. So we do that at our school, where we have a local case management team, and you'll come and bring any concern. It could be academic, it could be behavior, it could be emotional. You come to the team, explain what you're seeing. They're going to give you supports, ideas, things you can do. Someone might meet with you after school to help. And then you'll, try whatever it is, come back, let us know. And it's supposed to be really like a brainstorming kind of help supportive meeting.
If you're wondering where to find proven outcome-focused ways to put the science of reading into practice, you're in the right place. Reading Horizons Discovery Product Suite is a foundational literacy program for grades K through 3 that leverages a versatile instruction method, a personalized student platform, and accessible learning aids that include phoneme cards, student transfer books, and decodable books. The program streamlines literacy instruction and empowers teachers so all learners can achieve reading proficiency. Go to readinghorizons.com/discovery to learn more and download the complete program details today.
And Stacy, this gets me thinking about Tim's presentation at Plain Talk too.
Yeah.
The social and emotional aspect of individuals who are struggling with reading, right? I mean, he does a really compelling job. Anyone, if you have an opportunity to conference to hear him give that particular talk, please go in and listen. But it makes that even more important, because I think that's the piece, Stacy, that often is missing. I think if I see anything, it's more of an RTI. There's some tiers going on. A student might be moving to a tier 2 to get some intervention directly for some sort of academic support. So typically with reading. But then I don't see a great deal going on to help support the other aspects of a student that oftentimes has anxiety that goes along with this, that there's a good deal of depression that can occur, and that feels on the outside of a classroom, not really on the inside of a classroom. And I don't know that we're really reaching those needs on that MTSS grander scale. I don't know, it's just a thought.
So you know what? I have had a slightly different experience, but I still agree, because in my district, and I am talking years ago, we had a very progressive team, and we implemented and I feel like historically RTI was a thing before MTSS was.
Yeah.
And in some cases, people say, well, MTSS has replaced RTI, but you always need to be attending to response to instruction and intervention. So I don't think it can be replaced. But we did a good job in the district I worked in of really having a solid plan. And we had a pyramid, and it had literacy and math and behavior. But, and so within that, like if a student struggled with behavior, and my first job in the school district actually was the behavior interventionist, but we had a plan in place for those students. What was missing was the integration we're talking about, because often behavior was considered separately from how it impacts their academics and vice versa. So, and I echo, when we do have Dr. Odegard as a guest, let's ask him to talk about the contents of his presentation at Plain Talk, because I also think those things cannot be separate from each other either. And in my experience, they were, even in an MTSS model, you got support, but it was for separate things, not how those impacted each other.
Yeah.
So great questions. I know the question I often hear educators ask, what's the difference between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3? And let's just talk about some aspects of that. So tier 1, Lindsay, you've already mentioned this, every student and it receives tier 1 instruction. They are part of tier 1, no matter. And it should be aligned with these structured literacy principles that we're talking about. The components should be there. It also includes knowledgeable and skilled teaching in that area. And from all of the MTSS models, we notice that if things are all aligned, about 80% of your students should be making adequate progress based on that. What else would you like to say about tier 1?
I want to add, and Lindsay, you've mentioned it many times, let's not forget the student who's receiving services maybe at a tier 2 or tier 3 gets tier 1 too, right, Lindsay?
Yes.
We've had this conversation a lot.
Yeah. And I would say as well, that's the type of instruction. We often classify students like that. They're not classified like that. That's the type of instruction they're receiving. So every student receives tier 1 instruction always. There's never an exception, right? And then tier 2, Lindsay, how would you describe tier 2 and its relationship to tier 1?
It can be additional, it can be like a double dose of something. It's generally going to be in a smaller group than you did in tier 1. So that it's a little more intense. It might be a little more frequent. You could increase the dosage. So yes, frequent, but also how long they're working with you. The intervention, the tier 2 intervention could be provided by the teacher. It could be provided by an interventionist. It can look different. It really kind of depends your school setup and the supports you have.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one thing I forgot to mention in tier 1, it does include differentiated instruction.
Yeah.
So you can have small groups, tier 1, no matter where the students are. One thing that Dr. Odegard says, and I'm on page 83 in the print manual, he talks about, of course, quality structured literacy instruction should be delivered from day 1 of kindergarten by teachers with knowledge of both the structure of English and how to teach students. Then in the next paragraph, he talks about, and he uses the word triage. So he talks about tier 2, and he says, when high quality structured literacy is well implemented as part of tier 1 instruction, and paired with universal screening and monitoring progress, learners who start to fall behind expectations can be more easily identified as soon as they struggle in learning essential literacy skills. And then the next sentence, when identified, these students should be triaged to receive additional intensive instruction as part of tier 2 instructional support using structured literacy. And I have heard the word triage before, but to be honest, it's mostly in reference to students who require tier 3 instruction. What do you think of that?
Well, I was just thinking in my head, wow, wouldn't things look a lot different if we actually did some of this? You know what I'm saying? And the dosage, the time. This is something we really need to talk a little bit about, because I swear we're so busy during the day, particularly in schools where you have so many needs. You really need to watch that, because you would swear that student has had the 30 whatever minutes that are committed. And what you'll find is little things eat away at that time. And what you find is in a day, a kid may only be getting 10 to 15, and that is not effective. And yet then you'll say, oh, they don't respond very well to intervention. I've seen this happen this is why I'm saying it's because it happens even with the best of intentions, because you just get so distracted and busy. But it isn't the fault of what was occurring. The student never got near the dosage the student should have been receiving.
Yeah, there's so many things that can interfere with that. Researchers call it academic learning time. The minutes the students are actually engaged in learning, in something that's going to improve their learning. And sometimes in small group, and I hate to say it, but sometimes we have very well-intentioned paraprofessionals maybe that are providing intervention, but they might not have the training or the expertise in behaviors And so if you have them dealing with difficult behaviors or not sure how to handle the group, you lose a lot of time. And I think that's an important point, because you could say, oh my gosh, they're getting 30 minutes. Why isn't it working? Maybe we need to increase that, but maybe we need to look at what is happening within those 30 minutes and how many practice opportunities are they getting within that 30 minutes, or are they just sitting there listening to something and not actually engaging?
And I think that's where a system of support could be improved, because I know in schools that I'm in frequently, their intervention time for tier 2 is 30 minutes. But like you're saying, Lindsay, that's the total time allowed. But it takes a good 5 minutes for the students to move to the room, and then in 5 minutes for them to get back. So already we're just down to 20 minutes. And then, as you mentioned, if a behavior disrupts the instruction, or if the paraprofessional, whoever is providing the instruction, has a distraction, and that happens, I mean, they should be receiving this 30 minutes 5 times a week. But we could very quickly cut that time in half just by the accounting for those things alone.
And the same thing in our tier 1, the same thing. We allow 30 minutes for our phonics lessons. How much of that, are we actually using in that actual academic learning time? It's definitely a thing to consider, how to tighten up transitions to get, everything running smoothly and efficiently.
Also, I hope you're noticing when we're describing the difference between these tiers, the thread that's running through them all is assessment. And we'll talk about that in a minute after we describe a little bit more in detail about tier 3. So Dr. Odegard on page 84 in the printed version of this edition says, those students whose rate of learning in response to tier 2 instruction, structured literacy instruction, if they do not reach proficiency and meet grade level expectations, they'll need more intensive intervention. This type of intervention is often achieved through additional time to provide students with the dosage of intervention they will need to achieve academic success. You already mentioned that, Donell. As part of tier 3. In addition, a highly qualified instructor with deep knowledge of the English language and demonstrated instructional skill at delivering structured literacy is critically important.
And Stacy, I think that we put code word for tier 3 as it's a specific program. Okay, so notice how Tim is very careful, and he's helping. If we don't have the understanding, he's helping us come to an understanding. It's not a program, right? And more specifically, it's bang for your buck with the training of the individual and their understanding of how to teach that student, right? So that's so important.
So as a system, I guess one systemic support, how do you ensure a highly qualified instructor with deep knowledge of the English language and demonstrated instructional skill at delivering structured literacy? How would a system provide that?
Providing the training and support like we've all been talking about from the beginning and Lindsay mentioned, right?
And when necessary, the certifications.
Yes.
I think about that, especially when we're talking about students with dyslexia. Oftentimes, they'll have to go outside of the school to get a certified dyslexia specialist to tutor their, so to be tutored by. So lots of things. Lindsay, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wanted to say sometimes we think tier 3 means special education, but it doesn't have to be. It can be special education, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be more intense intervention, that the student still needs more. They need more in addition to tier 2 and in addition to tier 1. The thing that we haven't said that is so difficult is, when do you provide more time?
Yes.
I mean, time is like the most precious commodity. And you're like, well, we don't want them to miss tier 1. Well, we don't want them to miss tier 2. Well, we don't want them to miss math. We don't want them to miss science. They can't miss art. They can't miss PE. They can't miss music. And you're like, well, they're going to miss something. Okay, they're going to miss something. What do you do?
And so, Lindsay, that's why a lot of us with students who have dyslexia, our own children, at some point or another, at least one and maybe more folks at a school has pulled us aside and quietly said, if you really want to see him make gains, you're going to have to do this outside of school.
Yeah. And you have to be very careful if you work for a school district. Like, I can't say that because then the district is on the hook for paying for that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yes.
I can't say that as a teacher.
It is. Speaking of systems of support, this is another area that systemically can be improved. And I know when we first started implementing MTSS, some of us were confused about those timeframes and thinking that 30 to 45 minutes that students receiving Tier 3 instruction needed was in addition to Tier 1 and Tier 2. It's not. So you'll have a student in either Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction or Tier 1 and Tier 3 instruction, right? You don't do all three at the same time. But something else that, and that does become tricky, I have been responsible for creating those intervention schedules. And it is, I'm not prone to headaches, but it is a headache. It's so complex.
And Lindsay, or Stacy, just to be clear, a student could be in Tier 2 for math and maybe Tier 3 for reading. You're not saying that, right? But
Great point. Yes. Yeah, I'm just always hyper-focused on literacy. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think to consider how we're using the minutes and the time with the student. What do they need most, especially as we're talking about, oh my gosh, they need more. But what are we doing with the minutes? For example, students in my class, we have some that have been identified for intervention. They get pulled out for that intervention for 20, 25 minutes. Then they come back to my classroom, and I am doing small groups at this time. And I pull them back to work with me, and I give them what I know they didn't get enough of in the intervention, because in their intervention, they're really doing a lot of isolated phonics. I know the program they're using. They're really kind of, working at the word level, but they haven't had a lot of practice just reading text, connected text. So when I pull them back to my small group table, I'm not necessarily going to start with, okay, let's do a phonemic awareness warm up. Now let's dictate some words. Now because I know they've done that stuff already. So I'm just going to get right to reading. And because that's the part that they didn't have. And then I can support them right there. So.
And that's that communication between the tiers. That's beautiful. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Lindsay, because we don't say it enough, is your understanding of what your students received when they were in tiered instruction. Instead, it's like a mystery. They go through a secret door, they come back, they emerge again from the secret door. You have no idea what went on in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to say that too. That requires communication. Now, the district I worked in, we had a grant, but it took a grant where as a literacy coach or the reading specialist, and we had our director of special education and the principal, oftentimes we had time to meet with each teacher every week where we could make sure those things were being communicated. But that I know is not common. That is so uncommon. So a lot of times the teacher will need to approach the people who are providing that intervention to find out what it is they're doing. So I love how you're using that, Lindsay. One thing I wanted to point out too, starting on page 84 in the print version, that Dr. Odegard says, and he's talking about students receiving Tier 3 instruction, these students respond best to a sustained, I should clarify, if they have the profile of dyslexia. And notice he said profile and not diagnosis, right? Because we have many of our students who are not diagnosed. These students respond best to a sustained multi-component structured literacy intervention. Okay, that makes sense. The duration of the intervention these students will require has been documented to be multiple years. I think that's another area that the system has to support it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Built for an understanding that this cannot be done in a certain amount of time for certain students, right? With certain challenges. And that should be part of the system.
Well, and also why we shouldn't wait. Don't wait. And that's and I was told that by someone not long ago, and I was so frustrated because she said, sometimes these kids catch up. Not without intervention, they don't. They're just not going to magically get better. So they need the intervention, then they'll catch up.
They might look that way years later if their parents have then finally, out of frustration, realizing it's never going to happen, pulled them out and started giving them, right? Oftentimes I'll see them re-enter the school and they'll go, oh, look at he's made such a, you have no idea what went on outside of this place in order to have that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That is important. And, man, that's definitely an area for improvement. And then, as we say, don't wait. Like, that's where assessment comes in, right? What types of assessment are we talking about in an MTSS model?
Universal screening. Let's say it again. Universal screening.
Good job. I was about to say, I feel like I'm asking a quiz question. You get an A, Donell. Okay. So yes, universal screening for sure, because what is the entire point of a universal screener? To identify students who are not at benchmark or where they should be, right?
Or who are at risk for not getting reaching benchmark, right?
Yeah. Depending on the assessment, right? If the assessment was designed to measure risk,
good point.
then absolutely. And then what do we do?
Okay, first, can I mention I like Acadians? That's my shout out for the universal screener.
Me too.
Then what do we need to do? Well, we've got to give a diagnostic to the ones who were showed at risk on the screener or not at grade level. We got to get a diagnostic to see, hey, what exactly do they need help with? Because, the screener is not going to go into detail. It's going to say, these are your ones who need help. And now we need to see what exactly do they need help with.
And progress monitoring?
Progress monitoring.
What questions are we answering with progress monitoring?
Is the intervention working? That's what the progress monitoring is going to tell us. Is my instruction working? And you can look at this on the individual student level. You can look for broader patterns too, to say, hey, is my instruction working for my whole class? Or, if you're a coach, you're saying, hey, across the grades, across my school, who needs more support? Who needs help?
Yeah. And you could analyze your own data to know if your tier 1 instruction is working.
Right.
Well, because in theory, you should have at least 80% of your students at benchmark, right? Dibbles a long time ago. And I think Dr. Stephanie Stoller did say that Acadians has this kind of report that it does tell you how effective your tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 instruction appears to be based on your student data. And I found that very useful back in the day, not only to help support my teachers, but to know areas we needed to focus on for professional development. This is when I was in a more administrative position, obviously. But ask yourself those questions.
And if anybody wants more information on assessment, I think Louise Spear-Swirling, in our interview with her, she did a good job of talking about those and their importance, right?
Yeah, she really did. And I think Dr. Odegard points that out over and over again, that we need to, for students receiving tier 2 and tier 3 instruction, they actually need to be assessed more often so we can intervene faster. And the whole point of MTSS is to prevent reading failure, right? So analyzing within the system and within what we as teachers individually have control over, we're always going to help make improvements.
There's no point in giving the assessment if you don't do anything with the data. So don't make it a waste of time. You've got to respond to the data. If a student isn't doing well, you've got to change something, and just try not to take it personally. It's just, okay, something's got to change. Something's not working here. What can I do? But I think the key, because you can test all you want, and it's not going to do a single thing if you don't respond to the data you're getting from the test.
Love that. And then I'm going to add, because I've heard it before, with the universal screening. Well, we did that last year and they were fine. Remember, things can change for a student. Maybe that student was barely just hanging on. Remember, developmentally in those early grades, we want to catch those kiddos who maybe came in and they were just enough to keep them on board, but then the next year things got harder. So yes, that screener will do it more than once, and that kiddo may show up differently on that screener. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very important thing to notice. In DIBBLES, the D in DIBBLES stood for dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. So they are dynamic. The benchmark will change. And what's important at a certain point in development is the thing that changes, right? So very important to note that. And then I also appreciate, Lindsay, that you are highlighting that. And sometimes other people do that screening for us, and we just get the data as teachers. Don't waste their time either. There's good information in that assessment and good direction for you as a teacher. One thing I heard Matt Burns say a few months ago, if a student is still struggling, you haven't found the right assessment. Because if you don't know what they need, you need to make sure your assessment is the right assessment. And it makes sense. And we've talked about this a little bit before on other podcast episodes. But for example, Acadience and Dibbles and the like do a really good job of helping us to know which area a student might be struggling in. And then we could do it more diagnostic, to find out exactly where. But we've talked before about oral language screeners that aren't often, they're not given as often or as frequently in the way that reading screeners are. So that's something that systemically could help too.
We have one. We have an oral language screener at my school. The University of Utah comes in, students come in, and I think I don't know if they're piloting it. It's pretty new. This was the second year, and it's really interesting because I'm like, oh yeah, it definitely catches students. I need to find out what the name of it is, but it's interesting. Yeah. It's just now I need the support of what to do when it catches.
Well, and I think our speech and language pathologists, they definitely give a screener, right? Maybe in kindergarten, or I don't know. I should know more about that actually. So I will learn more about that, and we'll have a speech and language pathologist on our podcast soon. So maybe we can talk about that then as well. Well, thank you both for this conversation. There is one quote on page 85 that I will just kind of end our discussion with, unless you guys have anything else to add. And it states, "The beauty and power of structured literacy is the intricate weaving together of critical reading-related skills through direct and comprehensive instruction." I think that kind of sums up this article quite nicely. Thank you for the conversation. It's been awesome as usual. And thanks to all of you who have joined us. And we'll see you in the next episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where literacy momentum begins. Visit readinghorizons.com/literacy talks to access episodes and resources to support your journey in the science of reading.